rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope that you can hear me. If there's any issues, do let me know. But I think we're ready to start, inshallah. So let's just begin this lesson. So just to recap, because last lesson we were halfway through or 3/4 of the lesson through to talk about, which was the topic of Qadha. And just to recap before we dive into things, is that we talked about this idea of there is a obligation upon us, and you can divide them into two types. One is Qadha, which is delivering the duty as you have been ordered to do so, and Qadha is delivering the duty but in a way that resembles it. And then after that, we talked about Qadha al-Kamil and Qadha al-Qasir. Qadha al-Kamil is to do something exactly as the lawgiver, Allah, has told us to do it, or the Sharia has told us to do it. And that would be an example, would be to perform the 5 times daily prayers with all its postures done as best as one is able to do so. The second type from Qadha was Qadha al-Qasir. This is where you do it, but you do it in a deficient manner. So sticking with our example, you perform the 5 times daily prayer, but you're rushing, for example, and you haven't done it properly. And the prayer is still valid, even though there's a deficient element in it. Okay, so the ruling for Qadha al-Kamil is that by doing it, you've fulfilled it, and you're no longer responsible. You're no longer mukallaf of that responsibility, and you're free from that responsibility. That's the Qadha al-Kamil. Qadha al-Qasir, when we talked about it last week, was to do it in a deficient way. So I gave the example of performing the prayer. You perform the ayn, the prayer, the salat itself is what you need to be praying. Though your sifa, the attribute of your prayer in terms of doing it in the best way possible, is deficient. So your prayer is valid, but it's valid in a deficient sense. Okay. And the other thing we talked about as well was that for as long as Qadha al-Qasir, we talked also, there's one more thing I need to say. The ruling on Qadha al-Qasir is that if it's possible to compensate for a deficiency with something similar, then you will compensate for it. Okay. So for example, and if you can't, then you're not going to do it. So for example, if you didn't do the prayer properly, you rushed the prayer, for example, then you can't compensate for that, right? Your prayer is valid. You'll just be held responsible for not perfecting the prayer or praying it in an imperfect manner. So we talked about all of that last week. Let's move on today and just kind of finish off a few more things to do with hopefully, if we have time today, we'll move on to the topic of Qadha, inshallah ta'ala. So let us begin. Now, what I want to talk about here is a few things. And I'll just draw some diagrams if I need to. Otherwise, I'll just explain them. So when we're delivering what is necessary, the default is always going to be the Qadha. Yeah? That's always going to be the default, if you like. And that makes sense. Because when it comes to doing things, that you want to do it in the perfect way, whether it's to do with prayer, whether it's to do with rights of other human beings. So you can't go to Qadha for as long as Qadha is possible. Right? So for example, 5 times daily prayer, you have to pray Asr on time. Right? It'll be Asr time very, very soon. For as long as you're able to pray Asr in its time, there is no option for you to do Qadha of it. That's a simple, really simple example. So you can't resort to Qadha when Qadha is still only possible. Only when there's no possibility, then you will move to Qadha, right? So that's when you go to Qadha. Only when there is no other possibility. Very, very important. Okay. The default is always going to be Qadha. Because if you think about it, the Qadha is the actual requirement. That's what is expected of you. So, if you take examples, let me just take some examples. Let's not use religious examples. Let's use like everyday examples. Say somebody gave you a deposit, or you were representing somebody, or something was stolen. So there's three scenarios here. So if somebody was to deposit money, right, and there's a defined amount of money that's been deposited, and there's an exact amount that's been deposited, you have to give that back. Right? You can't say, oh, you gave me £1 million and I'm going to give you something else equivalent to that. Right? Because you can give them back £1 million that's been deposited. Another example, if somebody was entrusted with something, you were given something to look after, then you should give it back exactly as it was entrusted to you, because it's ada. You can't say, oh, can I give you something else in its return? Even though you trusted me with the item, I'm going to give you something else in its return. No, because you can and you should give back what was given to you. Okay? If somebody was to steal something, right, and they say, well, and they had to return it back, and say, instead of returning the item back, they said, oh, let me return something else back to you in return. That's not allowed, because as long as the ada is possible, as long as you can return back to them what was taken originally, you will always fall upon the default, the ada, what was taken originally. Now we'll talk about scenarios when that's not possible. So what happens if you stole something and you can't return the item back? It's broken, it's damaged, you sold it on. We'll talk about those examples. But this, what I've just presented here to you, is the normative. This is what is expected. Okay. So based on this, let's just look at one scenario. So for example, say there's a buyer and there's a seller. Okay. And the seller sells something to the buyer. Say it's an item. Let's imagine it's an item here. And of course, the buyer gives him some money in return. Yeah. So this is what happens. Normal everyday transaction. So somebody sold something, they gave it to the buyer. The buyer goes home, and then what happens is he goes home with his item, and he finds there's a deficiency. Something's wrong with it. It's not what I thought it was. Some fault in it. It is the item, but there's a fault in it. Okay. And this fault, this deficiency happened when it was with the seller. So when he had it. So what can you do? So in this scenario, the buyer has two options. Okay, the buyer, let me try to do this for me. The buyer has two options. One option is to keep the item, and the other option is to return the item. Two options that he has. Okay. So if he's kept the item, the transaction is now validated. Or the item is returned and transaction is invalidated. And he gets his money back. So the seller will give him his money back. The buyer can't say, he doesn't have a third option, which would normally be that I'm going to keep the item, but you compensate for the deficiency. Because when the seller gave him the item to him, this item here, he gave it to him, but it was a deficient type. It was a qasir. Deficient. Ada. It was ada, but it wasn't qadha. It was ada, but it was done deficiently. And so he will either keep the item or return the item back. Because what's happened is we're still on the default. It's still an ada, but it's ada ul qasir. It's an ada ul qasir type. Okay. So because it was deficient, he has to give the whole thing back. And so he can refuse it. But because it was ada, he got the item, it was a qasir type, he has to return it back. And of course they could reverse the transaction. So this is just to take it one step further. If you still want to do what they could do, they could reverse the transaction and do a new fresh transaction. So he will say, I'll return the item back to you. I still want it. Can we start a new contract? right? Knowing that it's a deficiency, because now you know what's going on. Okay. So there's no third option. Now, based on this, let's look at some examples. So I said to you, what if the item is taken and then the item is changed in such a way that you don't even recognize it? Then we'll talk about some of these scenarios. So let's just take some scenarios. Now we're going to use the position of Imam Shafi'i, denoted by an S here. Now he has a position, and this is says that if somebody was to steal something, you must return. Now this is really important. You must return, put it in capitals, exact item. You must return the exact item, even if it's changed beyond recognition. And if there's any deficiency, then he will need to compensate for that at the time. The Hanafis say that if the deficiency is to a degree where the item is unrecognizable, I'll give you examples of what that means. Unrecognizable. So if the item is unrecognizable, yes. Okay. That's got a different name, different value. Then what happens is that the item now belongs. Item is now for the person who stole it, so usurper, and he will pay. For usurper, he will pay. He's for him, and he will pay compensation. He will pay compensation for the loss of the item to the person that he stole from. Okay, that's an example. So what we're saying here is this: there's this idea that Imam Shafi seems to be saying you have to return the exact item back. The Hanafis seem to be saying, well, that's good, but what if the item has changed? What if the item has changed to such an extent that its name has changed? Its properties have changed. So what will happen is the usurper, the person who stole the item, he'll keep it, but he will have to compensate for the item to the person that he stole from. So let's look at some examples. And this actually impacts rulings. So for example, I'll just speak about these examples. So for example, say somebody stole some wheat and then they grounded it. Somebody stole a wooden beam and they built upon it. Somebody stole a goat and they sacrificed it and cooked it. Somebody stole a bunch of grapes and juiced it. Somebody took some wheat and planted them to yield crops. Now, according to Imam Shafi'i, as you can see, the logic would be you have to return it, even though it's changed. Even though the items change drastically, you still have to return it. And it remains the item of the original owner. And of course, is there any loss or damage, the person who stole it will have to pay for it. But the Hanafis will say, because you've changed it, right? The item has changed, it's become almost unrecognizable. We give it, and it's got a different name. Say, for example, you stole a wood beam, and now it's become something that's part of the structure of a house. Yeah, becomes structure of a house. It's changed completely. It's got a different name, whatever. Then its benefits, usage has changed as well. So what happened is the person who stole it would keep the item, but he'd have to pay him compensation for the value of the item. Now, just to make this a little bit more interesting, just to kind of help us here, there are helpfully some guidance from the ulama in terms of how we understand change. So I'll just list them three for you now, and then explain them. There's three things is that that are important here. So I'll just write them down and then I'll explain them for you. Name and primary purpose. Number two is reversibility. And number 3 is difficult. Difficulty. I'll explain them all to you now. So, there are some exceptions to rule according to Abu Hanifa. Despite the drastic change and the unrecognizable change that might have happened to the item, it can, in certain circumstances, still remain in the ownership of the original owner. And the person who stole the item, they have to return it back, even if the item has been altered. Now, what are the first 3 things? For something to have changed to such an extent from its original state, 3 things should have happened. And if that has happened, then of course, the matter is that they can keep the item and return the payment, give the payment, not return, but make the payment. First of all, the name of the item must be changed. So it's called something else now. We'll come to some examples in a second. Number 2, that it's changed to such an extent that it's irreversible to separate it. If you were to take the beams out of the house, it would cause structural damage to the house. So you change the item to such an extent, you just can't go back to it anymore, to what it originally was. Okay? And related to that, there's lots of difficulty involved if you separate the item out and so forth. Yeah. So let's look at examples that I mentioned before. So in each of these cases, if there's been a change, but not so drastic, then the item needs to be returned. So for example, take the example of silver dirhams, yeah, or of gold dinars. So if someone has minted silver to dirhams or of gold to dinars, for example, they've changed the original item, but it doesn't change to a certain extent that is, you don't call them silver or gold. They are still silver and gold dinars. The name not change. They must be the same item. If they are the same item, they must be returned to original owner. Sorry. For example, if you think about a goat, if somebody was to slaughter a goat, some ulama would say that, okay, you slaughtered a goat, but the change isn't too drastic. Because even when you slaughter a goat, it still remains the name goat. You still call it goat's meat. So it still has the name goat to it. Right? So you've got to return it back. So you have to return the meat back. Similarly, if it comes to stolen wool, if somebody spun it or it was woven, there's been a change, but it's not drastic, because the purpose of wool in this case would be to spin it, which is what has happened. And the primary purpose is still found. And it's not changed drastically. So you need to return it back. And of course, all of this supposes these 3 criteria. So it might be that they have stolen wool and they've used wool for completely different purposes for what it's normally used for. And in that case, because the owner can't do anything with it, he would have to, the person who stole it would keep it and return it back to them. But the idea is this, really what we're teaching is that you will always try to go back to the original position, the other, as much as possible. So we've established a rule that when something is stolen and is changed drastically by the person who stole it, the ownership transfers to the person who stole it, and the person who stole it will have to pay for the cost. Of course, this goes against what Imam Shafi'i is saying here, rahimahullah ta'ala, right? Because according to him, the stolen item will return to the ownership or the owner even after major alteration and complete change. And this obviously gives different rulings, different verdicts. So for example, just to push this a little bit more before we move on, the Hanafis say that the price must be given, whereas the Shafi'is say that the item must be returned in any condition. This is what we established already. Imam Shafi'i then says that if somebody stole someone's slave, somebody stole a slave or an item, right? And the slave was stolen, and then he escaped, right? He escaped. What do you do? Because the person who stole the slave, he doesn't have the slave anymore. But because of Imam Shafi'i's position, what would happen is the person who stole the slave would have to pay the price. Yeah, according to Imam Shafi'i. But say, for example, he paid the price to the person he stole from, and the slave was then found. So according to Imam Shafi'i, because remember, the default is that you must return the item, then the slave will go back to the original owner. And the owner would obviously give the money back to the person who stole it. The Hanafis would say that once you paid money for the runaway slave, the ownership goes to the person who stole it. Remember that. So the slave doesn't belong to the original owner. So when the slave is found and returned, he will go back to the one who stole because it's under his ownership. But he's already paid the original owner. Now, what did he pay him? He already pays him a qadha. And because he didn't give him the money, he didn't give the slave back, he paid him back with a qadha. Because when he gave him the price, that was a qadha that he did. Yeah. He's paid him the money. And there's no reverting back. Once you've done the qadha, it's done. And so there's no need to return it. So that's the end of just ada for us. And let me just save that. And now we can explore the next topic. We'll see how far we move with this today, inshallah ta'ala. This is obviously a basic introduction, just to get you grounded in usul al-fiqh. And of course, inshallah, if Allah wills, we can do more advanced studies. Now, just like qadha, we've noticed that, just like ada, in qadha we have two types. Okay, we have qadha kamil, just like before, perfect qadha, and then we have qadha qasir, imperfect. Okay, just before I move on, I'm just going to put this out there so it's easy for you to remember. When it comes to qadha ul kamil, the delivery of something that resembles the task and responsibility is in form and value. So I'll put F and V, but what I mean by that is form and value. I'll give you some examples, so it'll be easy. Okay, for example, if somebody stole some wheat and the wheat perished, what you need to do is you need to give a similar measure of the wheat back to the owner. It's never going to be the exact same wheat, but it resembles it, both in appearance, form, and in value. This is a qadha al-kamil, because you've met both of these criteria. A qadha al-qasid will be missing the form and just the value. You'll just pay the value. So it's a delivery of something that does not resemble the task and responsibility of appearance, but it's equivalent to it in value. Right? So, for example, someone stole a goat, and a goat died or got killed or something. You have to pay for a goat, the person who stole it. But the payment does not resemble a goat in appearance, but it's equivalent in value. There's a resemblance between the stolen item and the payment, because the value of goats is measured by the price that is to be paid for them. But goats are not the same, because they have different types of goats. So when it comes to qasir, it's only the value, because you can't get something that is exactly the form. But if something that's in form the same, then we call it ada al-kamil. Now, of course, as you will probably already realize now, Qadha al-Kamil always takes priority. Right? And this makes perfect sense because it's the most perfect form of Qadha, sorry. There's a liability for something that's been destroyed or lost. The first thing you're going to do is find something that resembles that thing in appearance and in value. And this makes sense because in Islam, it's all about making sure that we fulfill the rights of other people. So this makes perfect sense. Right? You always give back as best as you can. If you can't do that, so you can't do it, then you go to Qadha al-Qasid. So you only go to Qadha al-Qasid when you cannot fulfill the Qadha al-Kamil. Right? So Imam Abu Hanifa would say, if somebody stole a replaceable item, something that you can get everywhere, you stole it, and says, I don't know, just take an example, really simple diagram. Somebody stole a cup or a mug. That's a replaceable item. For example, you can get it at shops, you can replace it, right? Then you would obviously replace that. But say it was something that cannot be replaced, right? So this is form and value, and you would do that. But say it's something that you can't replace, or you stole something that's replaceable, it got destroyed, but it's no longer available. Like they don't make these mugs anymore. Say it's a special type of mug. Let's try and make a special type of mug called special mug. Right? It's no longer available in the marketplace. So what will happen is they'll go to the judge, and the judge will decide. And then on the day that judgment is made, let's call it judgment day, you'll take what's called the market value, MV, market value. Because we only know that there's an inability to replace the item when the judge makes a ruling. This is to make sure there's no ambiguity, because the person that stole it might say, oh, I'll pay you back the price of the mug when it was cheap 10 years ago before you took me to court. No, what we'll say is, what is the market value on the day the verdict is given? The reason for that is now we know that you can't replace it. Right? And remember, we're going back to V, because you can't replace it. So we're doing Qadha al-Qasid here. Qadha al-Qasid, sorry. Because before the judge made a judgment, there was a possibility you might find a replacement. You might find the item. But once the judge says, no, it's not going to be found, then you will have to do this. This is why the ruling of a judge is binding. Okay. So that's like a really simple example. Now, just to kind of explore this, I think it's quite easy once you understand this. Say, for example, let's just continue. There might be things that have no exact equivalent, right? So there's none of this. Neither in, and you can't. It's just there's no equivalent for it, right? You can't even work out a value of this. Say, for example, that wasn't possible as well. So this is like a really pitiful situation. You can't replace the item. You can't. There's no form. There's no similar item. You can't value it. There's nothing out there, right? This would mean that there is no qadha. There's no qadha. No. This means that once qadha is necessary, al-qadha al-kamil will be required, which is what we established. Whilst this is possible, you can't take anything. That's because of the priority that's we've said, right? But if you're not able to do qadha al-kamil, then you go to qadha al-qasid, like we've established here. Cost of the item, cost or market value. But if you can't value it, no value. there's no value for it. Or there's no suitable compensation for it, right? Then there's nothing to compensate. No compensation. So what do you do? Well, the only thing that the one who finds themselves liable for this, they'll be sinful. There'll be a sin upon you. You've tried everything possible to redeem you. It's very, very interesting. The Sharia will always try to bring things back to the asl, which is to bring benefit to people. Okay. That's just an example for you. This is why the Ahnaf say that the loss of use of an item cannot be compensated. Okay. It's like an example. I'll just read out an example for you. Say somebody stole a slave of another person, and then he used his services for a month. As an example, someone stole a slave, stolen, and services, say 1 month. Okay. Or somebody stole a house, stolen, yeah, and then lived in there for a month, just as an example. So in the first case, the one who stole it is going to be instructed to return the slave, or the person who stole the house will be told to return the house. This will be a form of ada al-qasid. Right? You give him back the ayn, and you give him back the ayn, because you always fall back on the ada, remember? Right? So you give back what is rightfully theirs, and you can do it. You always go back to the ada. Yeah. Because the item is returned, and there might be some wear and tear from usage while there's been wrongful possession. So the item is returned, and we're happy with that. That makes sense. And that's a form of, so just put for both of them returned. But what about this use for a month? What about living there for a month? The answer to this is that we can't do that. Right? What do we do with compensation? What do we do with compensation? Because we only have two options. But one is to compensate like for like. So for the month. But there might be an argument made here that it's never going to be the same. People use the house differently. Bills are differently, things are different. Or one person has a slave for a month, different slaves do different types of work. Now, of course, I can see what you're going to say here, that in our modern age, we can know the bills. Of course, absolutely, and that's fine. You can then say, well, you lived in a house for a month, these are the bills, you compensate them. But in pre-modern society, this might have been difficult, right? So we're talking about areas where we're sticking to the principle where we can't work out a value. Remember this. If you can work out a value, then you can give the compensation. But I'm just saying here, just to help us think through as jurists, through these things. Or it might be that the house was not used for the entire month, even though they lived in it for a month, and they only used it for 10 days. Or when they stole the slave only worked for 10 days, for example. So it's hard for us to work out what the usage will be to give the compensation. But there's nothing here that we can work off. These are services, and there's a bit of ambiguity in it, right? We don't know. So there's a bit of unfairness towards the one who stole it. The conclusion is that usage cannot be adequately compensated for it either way. There's no liability, and there's sin. Right? That's what we go back to. But of course, what you would do in practice is that, in the case of the house at least, you might be able to work it out, and you might be able to come to an agreement. Remember, we're doing principles here. So in real life, the judge might say, well, let's see the bills. Because nowadays you can work out how much electricity was used, and you get daily. I mean, on my electricity bill, I know how much I use every night, for example, or every day. Okay. Imam Shafi, just to finish this off, just to make it a little bit interesting, Imam Shafi, may Allah be pleased with him, he obviously disagrees with the Hanafis, and he says there must be compensation. So I'll just put S there. Not a very good S, but an S. He likens it to a rental agreement. So they'll compensate them. There's a debate on this. We'll come to this in Qiyas later on. Right. This brings us very close to the end, but there's just one more point I want to make. I hope you've been following this. So the principle is that there's no Qadha al-Kamil. If there's no Qadha al-Kamil or Qadha al-Qasir possible, then there's no Qadha in benefits derived from usage. This is what we've looked at through the stolen slave and the stolen half example. So what the Hanafis do is they present an interesting case, and you'll see this in the Hanafi mazhab. They test their principles by looking at real life examples. So they use the case of two witnesses testifying. Two witnesses testifying. They testify, for example, that a person issued 3 divorces to his wife. 3 divorces. 2 witnesses after the consummation of the marriage. And what happened was the judge, based on what he heard from the witnesses, decreed, if you like, or separated them, the husband and wife, of course. Okay. And because he separated them, he also said the bridal gift, because it's happened after consummation, the bridal gift bridal gift by the husband has to be given. Okay, this is the law. This is the fiqh. Okay. Now what happens is these 2 people, they retract. Later on, they retract. They say, "Oh, we want to take back what we witnessed." Okay. And the husband says, "You've caused me injury because I paid money for this, and I've had to pay some money. I've had to give bridal gift to the child, the wife, and so forth, based on what you said." So the Hanafi fuqaha will say, there's no liability. Think this through for a second. There's no liability to pay for the losses incurred by the husband. That makes sense. Think about it. Imam Shafi, of course, would say they are liable. And of course, for the gift too. Think about why that is, based on the principles that we've just said. Right? There's no ada here. You can't give it back. There's no qada al-kamil. There's no qada al-qasir. There's no liability. Okay. Imam Shafi would say, no, there's a liability. You have to do something. This is why ada and qada are important. In most cases, what really happens is when there's no equivalent, there's no material liability, right? However, if the Sharia has specified something as an equivalent, even though it doesn't resemble the actual item in appearance or value, then that can be made equivalent. So qadha can be possible through what the Sharia has deemed equivalent. And he will need to do what's called a qadha al-shari. The example of this, the most famous example, is if you have an elderly individual, we call him a sheikh ul-fani. This is somebody who's not able to fast. Now the Sharia has given them a way of doing qadha al-shari. So they will pay what's called the fidya. They will pay the fidya. Okay. A form of redemption rather than fast. This is qadha al-shari, but this is the divine law giving this to them. There's no resemblance. I mean, if somebody pays £2.50 for a fast isn't worth £2.50. What's the difference? What's similar between money and fasting? Nothing. Okay. But because the Sharia has allowed this, we take it. Another one is when you kill someone by mistake, qatl khata, and there's a blood money that you need to give. The money you give doesn't resemble life in appearance or value. When you give money, if you kill someone by mistake, blood money, that money doesn't. It's not money. It's not life you're giving to them. It's not like for like, and the value you're giving is not the same as well. What's the price of a person? But this is because the Sharia allows this. In certain cases, the Sharia allows these things. I think we will stop there. Alhamdulillah. Beautiful lesson. We got through quite a lot. Also, barakah, alhamdulillah. Of course, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Okay, if you have any questions, inshallah, I will see you all. Next week, we'll look at Nahi. So we're moving on to, so we've done Amr, now we're going to move on to Nahi, inshallah. We're making good progress. I'll see you all next week. Subhanallah, bihamdihi, subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdika, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.